The call came on a Tuesday morning in November, the kind of gray, bone-cold morning that settles over small Midwestern towns like a held breath waiting to break. Eleanor Voss was 73 years old, and she was standing at her kitchen window with a cup of coffee she had not yet touched, watching the bare oak tree in the backyard sway in a wind that had no warmth left in it at all. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had been a widow for 11 months. The coffee had gone cold by the time her daughter-in-law's name lit up the screen of her phone. Diane. Eleanor stared at it for 2 full rings before answering, because in the 11 months since Gerald had passed, Diane had called exactly 3 times, and none of those calls had been to ask how she was doing. Eleanor. Diane's voice had that particular quality it always carried when she had already decided something and was simply notifying the relevant parties. We need to talk about the house. Eleanor set down her coffee cup carefully. Good morning to you too, Diane. I'm serious. We've all been talking, Marcus and Diane, and Brianna too, and we think it's time to have a real conversation about what happens next. With the property. With the estate. The estate. 47 years of Gerald's life, and hers, reduced to a word that sounded like a legal proceeding. Gerald's will was very clear, Eleanor said. I thought Marcus and the others understood that when it was read. There was a pause. The kind of pause that Eleanor had learned to recognize over her years of teaching middle school English, the pause of someone who was about to say something they had been rehearsing. That's actually what we need to talk about, Diane said. There have been some developments. Eleanor did not know yet what the word developments would cost her. She would learn within the week. Gerald Voss had been a quiet man in the way that rivers are quiet still on the surface, with tremendous force moving underneath. He had spent 30 years building a regional aviation company from a single-engine charter service operating out of a grass airstrip south of their small town of Millhaven, Illinois, into a network of regional routes and cargo contracts that stretched across 5 states. He had done it without fanfare, without the kind of self-congratulatory noise that lesser men make of their ambitions. He simply worked, steadily and without complaint, the way his father had worked the land before him, believing that what you built with your hands and your hours was worth more than what you said about yourself. Eleanor had been beside him for every year of it. She had been the one who answered phones in the early years when they could not afford a secretary, who kept the books in the months when there was barely enough in the accounts to cover fuel costs, who packed Gerald's lunch on the mornings he drove out to meet with regional airline executives who looked at him like he was an unlikely proposition. She had raised their son Marcus largely on her own during the stretches when Gerald's work demanded everything from him, and she had done it without resentment because she believed in what they were building together. Not for herself, for their family, for the life they were making from nothing but determination and 18-hour days. When Marcus was grown, he had joined his father's company. Gerald had been quietly, profoundly proud of this. Marcus had taken to the business side of aviation with real skill, and for a decade, father and son had worked well together, building the company further, adding routes, securing contracts. Then Marcus had married Diane Kohler, whose family had money and opinions about how money ought to behave, and the dynamic had slowly, almost imperceptibly shifted. Diane had never been cruel to Eleanor. That was the thing Eleanor found herself turning over in the months after Gerald passed, trying to understand. Cruelty would have been easier to name and to defend against. What Diane was, instead, was quietly dismissive in the way of someone who had decided long ago that you were not quite relevant. She called Eleanor Mom when Marcus was listening and Eleanor when he was not. She decorated Gerald and Eleanor's grandchildren, their granddaughter Brianna, and their grandson Cole with stories about her own family's history and achievements, and left Gerald's history, Eleanor's history, mostly unspoken, as if it were a lesser thing, a background fact rather than a foundation. Eleanor had loved her grandchildren fiercely and without condition. Brianna was 26 now and worked in marketing in Chicago. Cole was 24 and had his father's facility with numbers and his grandfather's stubborn streak. Eleanor had assumed, in the unexamined way of grandmothers, that she knew these children, that the years of birthday cakes and holiday dinners and long summer afternoons at the house in Millhaven had built something between them that was real and permanent. She would learn otherwise. Gerald had died in December of the previous year. A stroke, sudden and complete, On a Thursday morning, when he had gone into his study to review quarterly reports before breakfast, Eleanor had found him when he did not come to the table. The doctor said he had not suffered. Eleanor was not sure she believed this, not because she doubted the doctor, but because in her experience, dying was rarely as peaceful as the living needed it to be. The weeks after had been a particular kind of terrible, the kind that comes not from one overwhelming blow, but from 1,000 small indignities stacked one on top of another. The funeral home, the paperwork, the phone calls, the casseroles that appeared on her doorstep from neighbors who meant well and disappeared again when the novelty of her grief wore off. Gerald's attorney, a steady man named Howard Pratt who had known Gerald for 25 years, had read the will to the assembled family 3 weeks after the funeral, in the conference room of his small office on Millhaven's Main Street. Gerald's will had been thorough. The house in Millhaven, the family home where Eleanor had lived for 31 years, was left to Eleanor outright, with the provision that upon her death it would pass equally to Marcus and to a conservation land trust Gerald had quietly supported for years. The liquid assets, the savings accounts, the retirement funds, were divided, with the larger portion going to Eleanor and a meaningful share going to Marcus and his children. The company itself, Voss Regional Aviation, had been transferred to Marcus over the preceding decade in a structured arrangement that Gerald had handled carefully with his accountants and attorneys, ensuring a clean and legal transition. And then Howard Pratt had read the final item. The airfield at County Road 12, the original grass strip where Gerald had started everything, along with the 60 acres of land surrounding it, the original hangars, and the small wooden building that had served as Gerald's first office. These were left not to Marcus, not to the grandchildren, but to Eleanor alone, with full and unconditional title. Gerald's note in the will, read aloud by Howard Pratt in his careful, measured voice, had said simply, "Eleanor knows what this place meant to me. I trust her to know what to do with it." Marcus had been silent through the reading. Diane had not. "That airfield is a business asset," she had said, looking at Howard Pratt as if he were responsible for the situation. "Gerald built that company on that land. It belongs to the company, which means it belongs to Marcus." Gerald transferred the company's operations and assets to Marcus over the past 10 years, Howard had said patiently. The original parcel of land at County Road 12 was never part of those transfers. Gerald retained personal ownership of it throughout. He has left it to Eleanor as a personal bequest. "What is it even worth?" Brianna had asked, and Eleanor had looked at her granddaughter then, really looked at her, and seen something in the young woman's face that she had not expected to see there. Calculation. "The land alone," Howard said carefully, "has been assessed in the last 5 years at approximately $1.2 million. The structures are older but maintain historical and operational value. There has been interest from developers in recent years, as that area of the county has seen significant growth." The room had been very quiet after that. Eleanor had driven home alone, declined Marcus's offer to follow her, and sat in Gerald's chair in the living room until the light outside went from gray to dark. She held the copy of the will that Howard had given her, and she thought about County Road 12. She had not been out there in years. Gerald had kept the original property separately from the main company operations, had paid the taxes and maintenance on it himself, had never sold it despite several offers. She had never asked him why. She had assumed, in the way you assume things about a man you have lived beside for 47 years, that she understood without needing the words. Diane's call on that cold Tuesday morning came 6 weeks after the reading of the will. The developments, as Diane called them, were these. At some point between the reading of the will and that November Tuesday, Marcus and Diane had involved a private attorney. They had, with the help of this attorney and with the enthusiastic participation of Brianna and Cole, begun to build a case that Gerald's bequest of the County Road 12 property to Eleanor was improper. Their argument, as Eleanor understood it when Marcus finally came to the house 2 days after Diane's call and sat across from her at the kitchen table with the look of a man who has been told what to say and is struggling to say it, was that the airfield represented a marital asset that should be subject to equitable distribution, that Gerald had not been fully competent in his final years due to the health decline that preceded his stroke, and that the will itself had irregularities that warranted further examination. "Marcus," Eleanor said when he had finished. She kept her voice very even. She had taught middle school for 22 years before retiring, and she had learned that an even voice in a difficult moment was its own form of authority. "Is there any part of you that believes what you just said to me?" Marcus looked at the table. "Mom, because Howard Pratt has known your father since before you were born." Gerald updated that 2 years ago when he was perfectly well and perfectly clear in his thinking, and Howard was present for every word. If there were irregularities, Howard would have said so. "Diane thinks, I know what Diane thinks." Eleanor folded her hands on the table. "What I'm asking is what you think." The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. 3 weeks later, Eleanor received a letter from Marcus and Diane's attorney outlining their formal challenge to the will. The same week, Brianna called and left a voicemail saying she thought Eleanor should know that Cole had found the original signed copy of Gerald's will in the filing cabinet in Marcus's home office, and that he and Brianna had, and she used this word without apparent awareness of what it meant, disposed of it, to simplify things going forward. Eleanor listened to that voicemail 4 times. Then she called Howard Pratt. "They burned it?" Howard said. "Brianna said they disposed of it." "Eleanor." Howard's voice was very controlled. "I need you to understand something. Destroying a legal document in the context of an estate dispute is a serious matter, potentially criminal. I also need you to understand that it doesn't matter. I have the original on file here. Gerald anticipated that this kind of thing might happen. He knew," Eleanor said. "It was not a question. He was a careful man," Howard said. "He planned accordingly. Now, are you ready to do what he planned for?" Eleanor had said yes, though she was not entirely sure yet what she was saying yes to. What Howard explained to her over the course of 2 long phone calls was this. Gerald had not merely left Eleanor the County Road 12 property. He had spent the last 3 years of his life, quietly and with Howard's guidance, building a legal structure around that property that was, in Howard's measured professional opinion, nearly impregnable. The property was held in a trust Eleanor had been named beneficiary of years before the will was even written. The will itself referenced this trust, but the trust was independent of it. Even if Marcus and Diane somehow succeeded in challenging the will which Howard considered unlikely the trust itself would hold, Eleanor's ownership of the County Road 12 airfield was, as Howard put it, not a matter Gerald had left to chance. There was also, Howard mentioned at the end of their second phone call, something at the property itself that Gerald had wanted Eleanor to find. He had left instructions with Howard about this. He had asked Howard to tell Eleanor, when the time came, to go to the airfield and to go into the original office building and to look behind the framed aviation map on the north wall. "He wanted you to go yourself," Howard said. He was very specific about that. Eleanor had not been to County Road 12 in 4 years. She had not gone since the summer before Gerald's health had begun its quiet, preliminary decline, when he had taken her out there one Sunday afternoon with no stated reason and walked her around the property without saying much, just the two of them moving through the long grass around the old hangars, Gerald's hand at her back the way it had been for decades. She had thought then that he was simply nostalgic. She understood now that he had been saying something she had not had the language to hear. She drove out on a Wednesday morning in December, exactly 1 year after Gerald had died. The county road was empty at that hour. The fields on either side had been harvested months ago and lay bare and brown under a sky the color of old pewter. The turn onto the property was marked by an iron gate that Eleanor had the key to, a key she had carried on her key ring for 30 years without ever having reason to use it. The lock turned smoothly. Gerald had seen to that. The lane from the gate to the buildings was a quarter-mile of packed gravel, lined on both sides with the remnants of a windbreak Gerald's father had planted in the 1950s, old cottonwoods that had grown enormous and somewhat wild, their bare branches interlaced overhead like the vaulting of an old cathedral. Eleanor drove slowly, her headlights picking out the texture of the gravel, and felt something she had not felt in 12 months. Not peace exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it, a stillness that was not emptiness. She parked in front of the original hangar, a long, low building of corrugated metal that Gerald had repainted every 5 years without exception right up until the end. The paint was still good. The doors were padlocked, and she had the key for those too. She stood for a moment in the cold, looking at the shape of the place against the pale sky, and let herself feel the full weight of what she was standing in. This was where it had started. A grass strip and one airplane and a young man who had decided, at the age of 24, that he was going to build something. She had known him then. She had been 22 and teaching her first year of school, and Gerald had come to fix the furnace in the school building. Because in those days he had done whatever work he could find between flying jobs, and he had asked her to have coffee with him with such straightforward sincerity that she had said yes without deliberating about it. 6 months later she had married him. She had never for a single day regretted it. The office building was smaller than the hangar, a wooden structure barely bigger than a generous garden shed, with 2 windows that looked out over what had been the grass runway, and a door that stuck in cold weather the way it always had. Eleanor shouldered it open and stepped inside. The air in the office was cold but dry, the particular preserved cold of a space that has been sealed against the weather. The smell was familiar and stopped her breath for a moment. Oil and old paper and the faint mineral scent of avionics equipment. The smell that had clung to Gerald's jacket in the early years when he had come home from long days at this place, and she had met him at the door. There was a wood stove in one corner that she knew Gerald had kept in working order, a stack of dry wood beside it. A metal desk, plain and functional, the same desk he had used since the beginning. 2 chairs, a filing cabinet with 4 drawers, all of them locked. A small window with a view of the runway that was now grass in summer and a pale frozen strip in the winter light. And on the north wall, the aviation map. It was a sectional chart of the region, framed in plain oak, the kind of thing that had been standard on the walls of small airfields for generations. Gerald had had this one since before Eleanor had known him. She crossed to it and lifted it carefully from the wall. Behind it, mounted directly to the wooden planks of the wall, was an envelope. A plain white envelope, sealed, with Eleanor written on it in Gerald's handwriting. His handwriting, which had been careful and slightly old-fashioned all his life, the handwriting of a man who had been taught by nuns and had never lost the habit of forming each letter completely. Eleanor held the envelope for a moment without opening it, with both hands, in the cold of that small office, while outside the December wind moved through the old cottonwoods. Then she sat in Gerald's chair behind Gerald's desk and opened it. There were 3 pages, written on Gerald's personal stationery, the cream-colored paper with his initials at the top that he had used for letters his whole life. Eleanor, he had written, if you found this, Howard finally told you where to look. I told him to wait until things settled, one way or another. I imagine they didn't settle quietly. I'm sorry for that. I knew Marcus would want this land, and I knew Diane would push him toward it. And I want you to understand that I made my choices about what to leave to whom with full knowledge of what those choices would cost you in the short term. I am asking you, one last time, to trust me. This property is yours. It was always going to be yours. The trust Howard set up makes that clear and makes it permanent. What Marcus and Diane's attorneys will discover when they pursue their challenge is that there is no legal avenue that leads to them taking this land from you. I was thorough. I was also, perhaps, not thorough enough in explaining to you what this land is actually worth now, which is why I am writing this letter rather than having Howard explain it to you in an office, because I want you to understand it the way I understand it, not as a legal document, but as a truth. The County Road 12 property, the 60 acres and the buildings and the airstrip, is worth considerably more than what was assessed 5 years ago. I did not update the assessment because I did not want that number to be part of the public record during my lifetime, and because I did not want Marcus or anyone else to know what I knew. In the past 3 years, 2 regional development groups and 1 national logistics company have approached me about purchasing this parcel. The most recent offer, which I declined 14 months ago, was for $4.7 million. I declined it because it was not what I wanted to do with this place. I did not want to sell it to developers. But what I want for this place and what you want may not be the same thing, and so I want you to have the full truth of what you are holding. The filing cabinet has 4 drawers. The key is in the top right drawer of the desk, taped to the underside of the drawer. The bottom 2 drawers contain the records of every offer I received on this property and every communication I had with those parties. The top 2 drawers contain something else. 22 years ago, when we were struggling with a particular dry stretch in the company's early years, I began a practice that I never stopped. Every month, from the account I kept separate from the business, I deposited a small amount into a savings vehicle I set up in your name only. I told myself at the time that it was emergency money. Then the emergencies passed, and I kept doing it because it had become a habit and because I believed, without ever quite articulating it to myself, that there should be something in the world that was yours without condition. The documentation in those top drawers is the accounting of 22 years of that practice. The current value of that account is in the most recent statement, which you will find in a red folder in the top left drawer. I want you to know why I did not tell you about this while I was living. I know you, Eleanor. I know you the way I know the geography of this county from the air, from having flown over it so many times that every landmark is part of how I understand where I am. If I had told you about the account, you would have used it for the children. You would have used it for the house, for Marcus's college, for Brianna's wedding, for Cole's business venture that went sideways 3 years ago. You would have found 1,000 good reasons to give it away because that is who you are, and I love that about you, and also I needed to protect you from it. This money is not for any of those things. It is for you, for whatever comes next, for whatever you decide to do with this land and this life that is now entirely your own. One more thing. When I walked you around this property that Sunday 4 years ago, I was trying to show you something I didn't have words for. The grass had come back the way it does every year in the spring, and the old cottonwoods were full, and if you stood at the south end of the runway and looked north, you could see the whole length of it, the way it had looked in the beginning, before everything else grew up around it. I wanted you to see it the way I had always seen it, not as a business asset, not as real estate, as the place where I decided to be brave enough to try. I am asking you, now, to be brave enough to try something too. You will know what it is when you're ready. You always have. All my love, always. Gerald. Eleanor read the letter twice in the cold office, and then she sat for a long time without reading anything, watching the light move on the pale frozen strip of the old runway through the small window while the wind worked through the cottonwoods outside, and she let herself grieve completely, fully, without any of the managed composure she had been holding in place for 12 months. She grieved the husband she had lost. She grieved the grandchildren she thought she had known. She grieved the 47 years of giving that had been so quietly, so thoroughly returned to her in this cold small room by a man who had apparently spent decades planning for a morning exactly like this one. Then she found the key taped to the underside of the drawer, exactly where Gerald had said it would be, and she opened the filing cabinet, and she found the red folder, and she opened it, and she sat with the number on the most recent account statement for a very long time. The account held $843,000. She sat with that for a while. Then she stood up, went to the wood stove, and started a fire with the wood Gerald had stacked there, and she waited in the growing warmth of the office until her hands stopped shaking, and then she picked up her phone and called Howard Pratt. "I found the letter," she said when he answered. "Good," Howard said, and she could hear the quiet relief in his voice. "How are you doing?" "I'm at the airfield," she said. "I'm going to need some time out here." "Take whatever time you need. Marcus's attorneys filed their formal challenge yesterday. We'll respond next week. You don't need to do anything right now except understand that the ground you're standing on is yours." Eleanor looked out the window at the old runway, pale and still under the December sky. "I'm starting to understand that," she said. She spent 4 more hours in that office on that first day, working through the filing cabinet drawer by drawer, reading the history of the offers Gerald had declined, the documentation of the account he had built for her, the notes he had kept in his precise and careful handwriting about the property, its condition, its history, his thinking about it over the years. It was like reading a long conversation he had been having with himself about something that mattered deeply to him, a conversation she had not known was happening. She drove home in the dark with the heat turned up and Gerald's letter on the passenger seat beside her, and she thought about what bravery looked like at 73. She had been afraid, she realized, since Gerald had died. Not in the acute way, not the sharp fear of a specific danger, but in the low constant way of someone who has had the floor removed from a room they thought was solid. The house in Millhaven was hers, yes, and her pension was modest but sufficient, and she was not in any immediate material danger. But the challenge to the will had made her afraid in a way that went deeper than money. It had made her afraid that she was what Diane's manner had always suggested she was: peripheral, easily managed, someone whose time and role were finished. Gerald's letter, in its quiet and thorough way, had said otherwise. She was not peripheral. She was the one he had been building toward all along. She was the one he had trusted to decide what came next. She pulled into her driveway and sat for a moment in the dark car, looking at the lit windows of her house. Then she went inside and made herself a proper dinner for the first time in weeks, and she sat at the kitchen table and ate it. And she thought about a 60-acre piece of land with an old runway and enormous cottonwood trees, and the particular quality of silence that exists at the edge of fields in winter. She thought about what she might build there. She thought about bravery. She thought about Gerald's voice on that Sunday afternoon 4 years ago, saying nothing in particular as they walked the perimeter of the property in the long summer grass, his hand at her back, the sky enormous above the flat Illinois land, the cottonwoods swaying in a warm wind from the south. She thought she was beginning to understand what he had been saying. She went to bed early and slept without dreaming for the first time in a year. And in the morning, she woke to a hard, clear frost and pale winter sunlight. And she made her coffee, and she stood at the kitchen window with it warm in her hands, and she thought, well, it is time to begin. The frost held through the end of December and into the first week of January, which was not unusual for central Illinois, but felt, that particular winter, like the landscape was making a statement. Eleanor drove out to County Road 12 every other day. She told herself at first that she was going to assess the property, to understand what she had, to think clearly. That was true, as far as it went. But the fuller truth was that the airfield was the only place she felt like herself anymore, and she needed that the way she needed water and sleep. She always arrived in the early morning, before the light had fully committed to the day. She would unlock the iron gate and drive the gravel lane under the bare cottonwoods and park in front of the old hangar and sit for a moment before getting out, letting the silence of the place settle around the car. It was a particular silence, not empty, but full of wind and the distant sound of a farm somewhere to the west, and the occasional passage of a small plane crossing the pale sky, far overhead, and beneath all of that, the silence of a place that had been waiting. She had started making the office habitable in small practical ways. A better space heater to supplement the wood stove, a folding table and a proper chair, an extension cord run from the single electrical outlet to a lamp that cast a warm pool of light over the metal desk. She brought a thermos of coffee each morning and drank it while she worked through the filing cabinet, reading the history Gerald had left her, understanding more each day about the quiet thoroughness of what he had done. The development offers in the bottom 2 drawers were illuminating in ways that went beyond the dollar amounts. Gerald had documented not just the offers themselves, but his reasons for declining them. The notes were brief and not written for any audience, but himself the kind of notes a careful man makes to keep his own thinking straight. One developer, a regional group proposing a mixed-use commercial park, had offered $3.2 million in 2019. Gerald's note said simply, strip the cottonwoods, pave the runway, put up a parking structure. No, a logistics company, whose offer had been the highest at $4.7 million, proposed to use the runway for small cargo aircraft and convert the land around it into a distribution facility. Gerald's note on that one said, this land fed a family for 3 generations before it grew a business. It doesn't end as a warehouse. Eleanor read that note several times. She thought she understood what he meant by it, and she thought she was beginning to understand what he had wanted her to know. The account statements in the top left drawer told a different kind of story. Gerald had started the deposits in the year that Marcus had been finishing college, the year the company had turned its first real profit after a decade of grinding, incremental growth. The early deposits were modest $200 a month, sometimes less when things were tight. But they had been consistent, month after month, year after year, through the company's fluctuations and the children's expenses and the periods when Eleanor knew, though Gerald had never said, that the margins were thin enough to be worrying. He had never stopped. He had simply reduced the amount in lean months and restored it in better ones, and over 22 years the patience of it had compounded into something extraordinary. She thought about the Eleanor of 22 years ago, the woman who had been running a household and teaching full-time and managing the invisible labor of keeping a family's life coherent, who would never have asked Gerald to set money aside for her specifically, who would have found 20 reasons why that money was needed somewhere else. Gerald had known that. He had done it anyway, quietly and without fanfare, and he had never told her. And for a long time sitting in that small warm office with the space heater ticking and the frost on the windows, Eleanor was not sure whether to feel grateful or bereft that she had not known. She settled, eventually, on grateful. Bereft required her to imagine a different Gerald than the one she had loved, and she was not willing to do that. Howard Pratt called on a Thursday in mid-January with an update on the legal challenge. Marcus's attorneys have hit every wall we expected them to hit, Howard said. The trust structure is holding exactly as Gerald designed it. They filed a motion last week arguing that the trust itself was improperly established, and the judge denied it this morning. I want to be honest with you, Eleanor. They could continue to pursue this, but at this point they are spending significant money for diminishing returns. I expect they'll withdraw within 60 days. And if they don't, then we continue to prevail. Gerald left nothing to chance here. I've been doing estate law for 30 years, and this is one of the most carefully constructed protections I've ever helped build. He started planning this 15 years ago. 15 years. Eleanor thought about that after she hung up. 15 years ago, she and Gerald had been 58 and 61. Marcus and Diane had been married for 7 years. Brianna had been 11. Cole had been 9. What had Gerald seen then, 15 years ago, that had made him begin building walls around this particular piece of land? She asked him the question in her mind the way she had taken to doing, addressing him in the silence of the office or the quiet of the house, and waited for what she thought of as his answer. Not a voice, not anything mystical, but the memory of something he had said or done that spoke to the question. What came was a Sunday afternoon from a long time back. Gerald driving home from a family dinner at Marcus and Diane's house in the new construction neighborhood where they'd lived for a few years, his hands easy on the wheel, the radio off, and finally saying, without preamble, Diane is going to be a problem. Eleanor had told him he was being unfair. He had nodded and said nothing else, and she had thought he'd let it go. 15 years ago, she had been too generous and he had been too patient, and between the two of them, they had loved their son right past the point of seeing him clearly. That was the grief underneath the grief, the one Eleanor had been circling since November. Not just the loss of Gerald, not just the betrayal by Marcus and Diane and the grandchildren. The loss of the story she had told herself about her family. The story in which love given freely and consistently was returned in kind, in which devotion built something that held. She had believed that story for 47 years, and it had been, not entirely false, but incomplete in ways that Gerald had apparently understood long before she did. She allowed herself 2 weeks to grieve that story fully, to sit with the wrongness of it, the particular hollow feeling of having been so thoroughly mistaken about something so fundamental. She gave the grief its due because she had spent a year trying to manage it into something smaller and more convenient, and it had not gotten smaller or more convenient. It had just waited. And then, at the end of those 2 weeks, on a morning in early February when the temperature had dropped overnight to something brutal and the sky was the particular blue that comes after a hard freeze, Eleanor drove out to County Road 12 and walked the full perimeter of the 60 acres for the first time. She dressed for it properly. Gerald's old canvas barn coat over 2 layers, his wool hat that she had found in the office closet, her own boots that were good to 20 below. She started at the south end of the runway and walked north, the frozen grass crunching under her feet, her breath making small clouds in the still cold air. The cottonwoods stood enormous and bare along the east edge of the property, and past them the land dropped slightly into a shallow depression that in wet years held water and attracted birds Gerald had loved to watch from the office window. The north end of the property bordered a section road, and beyond it, winter fields stretching to the flat horizon. She walked for 2 hours. She did not hurry. She looked at everything, the shape of the land, the quality of the light at different angles, the way the old hangars sat in relation to the runway and the cottonwoods and the road. She was looking for what Gerald had been looking at all those years. She was trying to see through his eyes. By the time she completed the circuit and came back to where she had started, her face was numb from the cold, and she could not feel her toes inside her boots, and she stood at the south end of the runway and looked north along its length and understood something she had been approaching for weeks. This place was not finished. It had never been finished. Gerald had preserved it not because it was complete, but because it was waiting for whatever came next, and he had given it to her because he had trusted her to know what that was. She thought about the 2 inspiration stories she had been carrying in her mind since November, not literally, but in the way that certain things you have heard or lived through become part of how you think. She thought about women who had been given ruins and made sanctuaries. She thought about the particular kind of courage required to build something at an age when the world has decided you are done building. She thought about the women she knew, the ones her age and older, who were navigating the particular wilderness of late life without maps, widows, women newly alone after long marriages, women whose identities had been organized around care and who found themselves, when the caring was done, uncertain of what remained. She had felt that uncertainty herself. She felt it still, but she was beginning to think that uncertainty was not an obstacle. It was the terrain itself, and the question was simply whether you were willing to move through it. She drove back to Millhaven with the heat on full and a clarity in her mind that felt like the first clear day after a long winter. She called Howard that afternoon. "I want to know the process for formally designating a historic airfield," she said. "And I want to know what permits would be required to develop a non-commercial facility on 60 acres of agricultural land. And I want to know whether the trust Gerald established allows me to improve the property without affecting the ownership structure." There was a brief pause on Howard's end, the pause of a man recalibrating. "It does," he said. "Gerald was explicit that the trust permits any development or improvement you choose to make. He also, and I should have mentioned this sooner, I apologize, he also left instructions with me about a contact. A woman named Ruth Adler who operates a non-profit organization focused on rural community development. He said she had expressed interest in partnering on a project at this property if you were ever inclined. He met her at a conservation board meeting about 3 years ago. He never mentioned her to me. No, he didn't want to say anything until you'd had a chance to find the letter and make your own decisions first. He wanted the ideas to be yours. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." Eleanor wrote down Ruth Adler's name and number. Then she sat for a while in the quiet of her house, at the kitchen table where she had sat through so many ordinary mornings with Gerald across from her, reading the paper, and she felt his absence in the particular acute way it came sometimes. Not the general ache of grief, but the specific, sharp missing of one person in one familiar place. "Okay," she said aloud, to the empty kitchen, to Gerald, to herself. "Okay, let's see what it is." She met Ruth Adler on a Wednesday morning at the airfield in late February. Ruth was 67, small and brisk, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of practical energy that comes from spending decades getting things done in places where resources are limited. She had driven up from Springfield and arrived precisely on time, which Eleanor appreciated. They walked the property the way Eleanor had walked it alone, but this time with Ruth asking questions and Eleanor answering them. And the conversation that developed over those 2 hours in the cold February air was unlike any conversation Eleanor had had since Gerald died. Ruth listened with the focused attention of someone for whom other people's knowledge is genuinely valuable, and she asked questions that made Eleanor articulate things she had been thinking but not yet said. "What do you want this place to be?" Ruth asked, standing at the edge of the cottonwood grove, looking at the long bare trunks against the winter sky. "Something useful," Eleanor said. "Something that justifies what Gerald kept it for." "That's a good instinct, but it's not an answer." "What kind of useful?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Gerald built this as a place for people who needed a way to get somewhere," she said slowly. "Literally. A small charter service for people in rural communities who needed to get to medical appointments, to cities, to family emergencies. That was the original business. He always said the point wasn't aviation. The point was access. Getting people to where they needed to be." Ruth was looking at her with real attention. And I keep thinking about the women I know. My age, older, some younger. Women who have spent their lives getting other people to where they needed to be and who have no idea anymore where they themselves are supposed to go. She stopped, slightly surprised by the precision of what she had just said. "I think this could be a place for that. For women who are in the middle of figuring out what comes next." Ruth nodded slowly. "A retreat and resource center. Something like that. But not spa weekends and motivational speakers. Something real. Workshops, legal resources, financial literacy, skills, community." Eleanor looked at the runway, pale in the winter light. "And I want to keep the airfield operational. Gerald would want that. It doesn't have to be commercial, but something active, something that still serves the original purpose." "There are organizations that operate volunteer pilot programs," Ruth said. "Medical transport, disaster relief. If the airfield were properly certified, you could host one. Bring it back to what it was originally for." Eleanor felt something settle. into place with the quiet decisiveness of a well-fitted joint. "Yes," she said. "That's it. That's exactly it." They talked for another 2 hours, standing at the edge of the property in the cold, and by the time they walked back to the office building and Eleanor started a fire in the wood stove and poured coffee from her thermos, the outline of something was taking shape between them. Not a plan yet, not specific enough for that, but a direction, and a sense that the direction was right. "Gerald mentioned you to his attorney," Eleanor said, handing Ruth a cup. 3 years ago. Ruth smiled. "He was a thoughtful man. We talked several times over the last few years. He never pushed. He just said he had a piece of land that might be useful someday and a wife who would know what to do with it better than he would." She paused. "He was very proud of you. He talked about your teaching, about the students you'd kept in touch with. He said you had the particular gift of seeing what people were capable of before they could see it themselves." Eleanor looked at the fire through the grate of the wood stove. "I didn't know he said things like that. He said a lot of things like that when he was here. I think this place allowed him to say things he couldn't quite say in his regular life." Eleanor understood that. She was beginning to think it might do the same for her. The legal challenge for Marcus and Diane collapsed in early March, exactly as Howard had predicted. The withdrawal letter from their attorneys cited a reassessment of the legal merits of the case, which was attorney language for "we cannot win this, and it is costing us money to try." Howard called Eleanor to tell her, and used the word concluded in the careful way of someone who knows that concluded and resolved are not the same thing. "It's over legally," he said. "What happens with your family relationships from here is your own business. I just want you to know the property is secure." "Thank you, Howard." Eleanor paused. "Gerald trusted you for 30 years. Gerald was a man worth trusting in return," Howard said. "I'll miss him." Eleanor did not hear from Marcus. She had not expected to. The silence from his direction had become its own communication over the winter months, and she had made her peace with it the way you make peace with a weather pattern, not gladly, but with the understanding that some things are outside your jurisdiction. Brianna called in late March. Eleanor almost did not answer, and then she did, because she had decided during the winter that she was no longer going to make decisions out of avoidance. "Grandma." Brianna's voice was younger sounding than Eleanor remembered, or perhaps just stripped of the polished confidence it usually carried. "Can I come see you?" "Why?" Eleanor asked, not unkindly, plainly. "Because I did something I can't undo, and I've been trying to figure out what to do about that since November, and I don't know what to do except come and say so." Eleanor thought about Gerald's letter. She thought about what he had written about trust. "Come on Saturday," she said. "Come to the airfield, not the house. I'll text you the address." Brianna arrived on a Saturday morning in early April, when the first real warmth of the year had come to the Illinois flatlands, and the cottonwoods at the airfield had begun to show the faintest suggestion of green at the tips of their branches. She was 26 and looked younger and more uncertain than Eleanor had ever seen her, standing beside her car on the gravel drive, wearing a jacket that was not quite warm enough for the morning. Eleanor had been painting the interior of the office. She had bought paint the previous week, a warm cream color, and she had started with the walls, working methodically from corner to corner with the focused attention she had once given to lesson planning. She came to the door when she heard Brianna's car and stood in the doorway with a paintbrush in her hand. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." Brianna came in and looked around the office with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a place. She looked at the framed aviation map back on the wall. She looked at the wood stove, the lamp, the folding table covered in Eleanor's notes and plans. She looked at the photographs Eleanor had brought from the house and arranged on the windowsill: Gerald at 24 in front of his first plane, Gerald and Eleanor at their wedding, the children when they were small, back when everything had still been possible. "He built all of this," Brianna said. "He started all of this," Eleanor said. "I'm going to finish it." Brianna sat in the chair across from Gerald's desk. Eleanor poured coffee and sat behind the desk, which felt right in a way it hadn't the first time she'd sat there, and waited. "I didn't know what I was doing," Brianna said, and Eleanor could hear the effort in her voice, the effort of someone pushing through rehearsed language towards something true. "When Cole and I, when we destroyed the will, we told ourselves it was just a copy, that it didn't matter, that the attorneys would handle everything. But that's not why we did it." She stopped. "We did it because Dad and Diane made it sound like something Grandpa had done by mistake, like he hadn't really meant to leave the airfield to you specifically. like it was an error and we were correcting it. And now, I've spent 4 months knowing that I helped destroy a legal document and told myself it was the right thing to do. And I can't make that okay. Brianna's voice had steadied, but her hands, wrapped around the coffee cup, had not. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think I have the right to ask that. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter for a long moment. She thought about the 11-year-old Brianna who had spent a summer at Eleanor and Gerald's house, learning to bake bread and read topographical maps and identify birds by their calls, because that had been the summer Diane had decided she needed a break and had sent both children to their grandparents for 8 weeks. That Brianna had been curious and slightly solemn and had followed Gerald around the property with a small notebook, writing down the names of everything he told her. Did you know, Eleanor said, that your grandfather kept a folder of every drawing you made during that summer you spent with us? You were 11. You drew everything. The birds, the plants, the machinery in the garage. He kept every single one. She paused. They're in the bottom right drawer of that desk. They've been there for 15 years. Brianna stared at her. He kept them? He kept everything that mattered to him. Eleanor set down her coffee. You did something wrong, Brianna. You know that. And there's no document or apology that corrects it. But you're 26 years old and you made a decision under pressure from your parents and you've been sitting with it for 4 months, which tells me something about who you actually are underneath the mistake. She stood and picked up her paintbrush. If you want to make yourself useful, there's another brush in the supply bag by the door. I'm painting the north wall this morning. Brianna looked at her for a moment, and then something shifted in the young woman's face, some held tension releasing. She stood and found the second brush and came to stand beside Eleanor at the north wall. They painted through the morning in a quiet that was not uncomfortable, and Eleanor told Brianna about Gerald's letter and about Ruth Adler and about the plan that was forming for the property, and Brianna listened and asked questions that were genuine, the kind of questions Eleanor had not expected from her, about construction timelines and nonprofit partnerships, and what certifications would be required to reactivate the airfield for a volunteer pilot program. I have a friend, Brianna said at one point, who works in historic preservation grant funding. This kind of project rural airfield with documented agricultural history and nonprofit community development plans, that's exactly the kind of thing those grants exist for. If you wanted, I could put you in touch with her. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, paint on her jacket, her hair escaping its tie. She thought, well, there it is. Yes, Eleanor said. I would want that. By the time Brianna drove away that afternoon, they had covered the north wall in warm cream paint and talked for 4 hours and made no promises to each other beyond the next concrete step. Brianna would send the contact information for her friend in preservation funding. Eleanor would continue what she had started. Whether more would grow from that was not yet determined, and Eleanor had learned over the winter to be comfortable with things that were not yet determined. She stood in the doorway of the office after Brianna's car disappeared down the gravel lane and looked at the late afternoon light coming across the old runway, golden and low, the way Illinois light gets in early spring when the days are lengthening and the land is beginning to remember what warmth feels like. The cottonwoods at the east edge of the property were undeniably green now, the new leaves catching the light and turning it bright and quick. There were birds in them that had not been there in February. The frozen strip of the runway that she had stood at the end of in December, trying to understand what Gerald had been saying, was grass again, pale and winter-flattened still, but grass, alive, the way it had always come back every spring since before either of them had been born. Eleanor thought about what she had told Ruth Adler, about getting people to where they needed to be. She thought she was almost there. She went back inside and picked up her paintbrush and finished the north wall by lamplight. And when she was done, she stood back and looked at it clean and warm, the color of something beginning, and she felt for the first time since Gerald had died what she could only describe as readiness. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the particular interior condition of a person who has found the ground under their feet and is about to move forward, one step at a time, into something they cannot fully see but are no longer afraid to go toward. She locked up the office and drove home through the spring evening with the windows down for the first time since fall, the air coming in cool and green-smelling, the first real smell of the season, and she thought, tomorrow she would call Ruth Adler. She would call Howard. She would follow up with the historic preservation contacts Brianna had offered. She would begin. Spring came to County Road 12 the way it always came to that part of Illinois, not all at once, but in increments. Each warm day, doing a little more work than the one before it. Until one morning you stepped outside, and the world had simply decided to be green again without announcing it. Eleanor was out at the airfield most mornings by 7. She had developed a routine the way she had always developed routines, quietly and without fanfare, until it became the shape of her days. Coffee in the thermos. Gerald's barn coat until the air warmed enough to shed it. The walk around the perimeter first, checking what had changed overnight, what the season was doing to the land. Then the office and the work. There was a great deal of work. Ruth Adler had connections that Eleanor was only beginning to understand. Within 3 weeks of their February meeting, Ruth had introduced her to a structural engineer who specialized in rural historic preservation, a woman named Pat Kowalski who drove up from Champaign on a Tuesday morning, walked every inch of the 2 hangars in the office building with a practiced eye, and produced a written assessment by the end of the week. The bones were good, Pat said. Better than good. Gerald had maintained everything with the same steady consistency he brought to everything else, and what needed doing was renovation rather than reconstruction. New electrical throughout. Updated plumbing in the office building. One section of hangar roof that needed replacing. The runway itself needed resurfacing and proper drainage work before it could be certified for active use again. The costs were significant, but not impossible. Not, Eleanor thought, with $843,000 sitting in an account with her name on it. She hired Pat's recommended contractors in April. Local crews from Millhaven and the surrounding towns. Men and women who had grown up in the county and knew the land and worked with the focused efficiency of people who did not have time to waste. Eleanor was on site every day they worked, not hovering but present, learning the vocabulary of construction the way she had once learned the vocabulary of literary analysis attentively, with the understanding that language was how you understood what was happening and why. Brianna's contact in historic preservation funding proved to be exactly as useful as Brianna had suggested. A grant application went in at the end of April for the airfield's designation as a historic rural aviation site, a designation that would come with both funding and protections that Eleanor found she wanted the property to have. The application required documentation of the airfield's history, and assembling that documentation became an unexpected project of its own. Eleanor working through Gerald's files, contacting former employees and passengers of the original charter service, gathering the account of what this place had been and what it had meant to the community it had served. What she found surprised her. She had known the broad shape of Gerald's early career, the years of the charter service, the clients he had flown. She had not known the details. In the files and in the memories of the people she contacted, a fuller picture emerged. Gerald had flown elderly patients to cancer treatment centers in Chicago when no other transport was available. He had flown emergency blood supplies during a winter storm that had closed the highways for 3 days in 1987. He had flown a young woman to a transplant surgery with 40 minutes to spare. He had done these things without making them part of the story he told about himself, because he had not considered them exceptional. He had considered them the point. Eleanor read through these accounts in the evenings at the kitchen table and felt the specific grief of learning new things about someone you can no longer speak to. The Gerald in these stories was entirely recognizable and also somehow larger than the one she had lived beside, because she was seeing him from the outside, through eyes that were not accustomed to him, and what those eyes had seen was a man of uncommon and unassuming purpose. She included everything in the grant application. Every flight, every emergency, every name she could find. It felt like the least she could do. Howard called in May with one final piece of news about the legal matter. Marcus's attorneys sent a letter, he said. Not a legal filing. A personal letter from Marcus. He asked me to forward it to you. What does it say? I haven't read it. It's sealed. It's addressed to you. Eleanor drove to Howard's office that afternoon and collected the envelope. She drove back to the airfield and sat in the office, now freshly painted, properly lit, warm in the May afternoon, and opened it. It was 2 pages in Marcus's handwriting, which was rounder and less precise than his father's. He had started twice, she could see from the crossed out lines at the top of the first page, before finding what he actually wanted to say. He did not excuse what had been done. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed. He did not explain it away or minimize it or reframe it as something other than what it was. He said he had allowed Diane to direct decisions that he should have made himself, and that he had told himself he was being practical when he was in fact being cowardly. He said the word cowardly, which Eleanor had not expected from him, and it cost the letter something to read it there in her son's handwriting. He did not ask to come to the airfield. He did not ask for anything. He said he wanted Eleanor to know that he understood what he had participated in, and that he was in the process of trying to understand how he had become the kind of person who could participate in it. He said this was taking longer than he had expected. He said he missed his father. Eleanor read the letter twice and sat with it for a while. Then she folded it and put it in the top right drawer of Gerald's desk, where it could stay until she knew what she wanted to do with it. She was not ready to respond. She was not sure she would be ready for some time. But she was glad he had written it, and she thought Gerald would have been glad too, and that seemed like enough to hold for now. The construction was finished by the end of June. Eleanor walked through the completed spaces on a Thursday morning when the crews had gone, alone in the early quiet, and took her time with each room. The larger hangar had been opened up and properly lit, its interior now a flexible space that could serve as a workshop, a meeting room, a teaching space. Ruth had helped Eleanor think through the programming, and what they had settled on was a center that offered practical resources to women navigating significant life transitions, legal clinics, financial literacy workshops, skills training, community connection. Not luxury, not a retreat in the spa sense of the word, a place of genuine use. Eleanor thought of it as the opposite of what her life had been in the years when she had given everything outward, a place designed specifically to help women locate and build what was inward. The smaller hangar had been converted into a proper aviation facility, its systems updated to meet certification requirements, its floor repainted, its equipment serviced or replaced. The runway resurfacing had taken 3 weeks and had been the most expensive single element of the project. But when it was done correctly, and Eleanor had stood at the south end of it after the cruise finished and walked its full length in the warm June afternoon and felt, more than at any other moment, Gerald's presence. Not as absence, as presence. As if the act of restoring the runway to working condition had restored something of him to the air above it. The volunteer pilot organization Ruth had connected her with a nonprofit called Midwest Passage that flew medical transport for rural patients had been interested from the first conversation. Their regional coordinator, a retired commercial pilot named James Okafor who flew out of a field near Peoria, had visited twice during construction and pronounced the restored facility exactly what they needed for their western Illinois coverage area. The partnership agreement was signed in July. Midwest Passage would use the County Road 12 airfield as a base for their western regional flights, contribute to operating costs, and bring their fleet of 4 small aircraft to the facility on a permanent basis. The first flight out of the restored airfield was on a Tuesday morning in late July. A woman named Dorothy, 81 years old, who lived alone on a farm 12 miles from Mill Haven and needed to get to a specialist in Chicago for a procedure her local doctors could not perform. James flew her himself, a courtesy for the inaugural flight. Eleanor was there when the plane taxied to the end of the runway, when it turned and paused for a moment in the morning light, and then gathered itself and moved and lifted, improbably graceful as small planes always are, into the pale summer sky. She stood on the edge of the old runway and watched until it was gone. She thought, there it is. That's what it was always for. The opening of the Eleanor Voss Women's Resource Center, she had let Ruth and Brianna talk her into using her name. Though it had taken some convincing, was held on a Saturday in September, in the kind of warm, clear autumn weather that Illinois sometimes produces, as if in apology for its winters. Ruth had handled the logistics with her characteristic brisk competence. Local press had been invited. The Women's Resource Network Ruth worked with had spread the word through their regional contacts. Howard Pratt came, and Pat Kowalski, and James Okafor, and a dozen former students of Eleanor's who had seen an announcement and driven from various distances to be there. Eleanor had not expected the turnout. Over 200 people came through the gates of County Road 12 that Saturday, walking the grounds, looking at the facility, hearing Ruth explain the programming. Several women stopped Eleanor during the day to tell her things she had not expected to be told, that they had been looking for exactly this, that they were widowed or recently alone and had not known where to go, that the combination of practical resources and genuine community, and the particular significance of the place itself meant something they could not quite articulate, but felt clearly. Eleanor listened to each of them with her full attention. She had spent 22 years teaching her students to understand that the stories other people carried were worth the effort of hearing. She had not stopped believing that. Brianna was there for the opening, and Cole, who had driven down from Chicago without Brianna and who stood for a long time by himself at the edge of the runway looking at the cottonwoods before he came to find Eleanor. He was quieter than his sister and more like Gerald in the way he had of holding something inside himself while he decided whether he had the courage to say it. When he finally spoke, he did not apologize the way Brianna had. He said, "I think I understood what I was doing at the time. I think I made myself believe I didn't, but I understood." Eleanor looked at her grandson. He was 24 years old and had his grandfather's eyes. "That's harder to admit than not knowing," she said. "I appreciate the honesty. Is there anything I can do?" Eleanor thought about it. The airfield needs people who understand how to manage the financial operations of a nonprofit. Ruth tells me we have funding for a part-time administrator for the first 2 years. She paused. "It's not a favor. It's a real position with real responsibilities. If you're interested, you'd have to apply through the proper process, and Ruth would make the decision, not me." Cole looked at the runway, at the restored hangars, at the cottonwoods bright with the first color of early autumn. "I'll apply," he said. He did, the following week. Ruth hired him in October. Eleanor had made clear she expected Ruth to hire him only if he was genuinely the right person for the work, and Ruth, who had not gotten to where she was by being sentimental, had called Eleanor after the final interview and said simply, "He's good. He's going to be good." Eleanor had sat with that for a moment and then said, "Yes, he's always been good. He just needs to practice it." Marcus came in November. He came alone, without Diane, on a gray weekday morning when the facility was quiet between programming sessions. Eleanor was in the office reviewing grant reports when she heard a car on the gravel drive and looked out the window and recognized her son's car. She did not go out to meet him. She waited, and he came to the office door and knocked, and she said, "Come in," and he came in. He was 51 years old and looked older than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply seeing him differently. The way you see people differently when the stories you told about them no longer hold. He looked at the office, at the photographs on the windowsill, at the aviation map on the north wall, and his face did something complicated that Eleanor did not try to name. "Dad's desk," he said. "His chair too," Eleanor said. "Sit down if you want." He sat in the chair across from her, the one Brianna had sat in April, the one Eleanor had come to think of as the chair for people who had come to be honest. She poured him coffee from the thermos without asking whether he wanted it. They were quiet for a moment in the way of people who have so much to say that none of it comes out first. "I've been trying to figure out how to come here for 4 months, Marcus said finally. "I know. Brianna told me. I don't know how to explain what I allowed to happen." He stopped. "I'm not going to try to explain it. I think explanations are what I've been hiding behind." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I think so too." He looked at Gerald's desk. At the framed photograph of Gerald at 24, in front of his first plane, young and clear-eyed and just beginning. "He would be ashamed of me," Marcus said. "He would be sad for you," Eleanor said. "That's different. Your father didn't have much room for shame. He had a lot of room for sorrow." She paused. "He loved you very much. He was afraid of you a little, of your judgment, of Diane's. He spent 20 years building legal structures around this property partly because he was afraid of what you'd do with it if he gave you the chance." Marcus absorbed that without defending himself. That, more than anything else that morning, told Eleanor something about who her son might still become. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Nothing," Eleanor said. "I don't need anything from you. I have what I need." She gestured, encompassing the office, the facility outside, the 60 acres, the restored runway, the volunteer planes in the hangar. "What I'm asking is what you need. Because you have a life that I suspect isn't working very well right now, and that concerns me, not because I can fix it, but because you're my son and I don't stop loving you because you hurt me." Marcus looked at his hands. "Diane and I are separating," he said. Eleanor had expected something like this, though she had not expected it quite so directly. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "I'm not sure I am," Marcus said, with the careful honesty of a man examining a true feeling for the first time. I think I haven't been sorry enough about the right things for a very long time. They talked for 2 hours. Not with resolution. Resolution was not something that could be achieved in a morning after what had passed between them, but with the particular quality of honesty that becomes possible when people stop trying to manage each other's impressions. Eleanor told Marcus what the winter had been like. He told her things about his marriage and his own unhappiness that he had apparently not told anyone. By the end of it, they were sitting with cold coffee and a quiet that was not comfortable exactly, but was real, which Eleanor had come to value more than comfort. When Marcus stood to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at the office, at the warm cream walls and the lamp and the photographs and the desk that had been his father's. "Can I come back?" he asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. "You can come back." She watched his car go down the gravel lane and disappear, and she sat for a while in the November quiet of the office, with the space heater ticking and the bare cottonwoods visible through the window, and she thought about the year that had passed. 12 months since she had stood at Gerald's desk for the first time with a letter in her hands and a number on a bank statement, and the slow dawning understanding that the man she had loved for 47 years had spent decades loving her back in ways she had not known to see. She thought about what she had built in that year. Not alone with Ruth and Pat and James and Brianna and Howard and the crews and the women who came through the doors of the resource center each week carrying their own weight of change and uncertainty and beginning. But also, she had to be willing to say this herself. She had built it. Eleanor Voss, 73 years old, who had been told in 100 quiet ways across a long life that her value was in her service to others. She had taken 60 acres and a letter and an old runway, and she had made something that would outlast her, that would fly people to where they needed to be, that would help women find the ground under their own feet. She thought Gerald would have found this funny. In the gentle way he found things funny. That it had taken losing everything else to make her stop giving herself away. She went out in the late afternoon light and stood at the south end of the runway and looked north. The cottonwoods were bare again, enormous against the pale November sky, their roots going down 30 feet into Illinois soil that had been farmed and flown over and loved for generations. The runway stretched away from her, clean and gray and ready, waiting for tomorrow's first flight. A man named Harold, 77, going to a cardiac specialist in Springfield, coming back the same day, coming back home. Eleanor stood there for a long time in the cold, her hands in Gerald's coat pockets, her face turned into the wind that came down flat from the north. She felt, in the particular way of people who have come through something difficult and arrived somewhere true, that she was standing in exactly the right place. Not because the difficult parts were over, they were not, entirely, and she was old enough to know they never entirely are. But because she had stopped waiting for someone else to tell her where the right place was. She had 47 years of a good marriage and a year of extraordinary loss and 60 acres of cold November land, and a runway that had always been about getting people to where they needed to be. She was exactly where she needed to be. The light was going, long and golden across the grass, the way Gerald had always loved it, and somewhere in one of the bare cottonwoods a bird was singing with no apparent concern for the season, and Eleanor stood at the end of the runway in the fading November afternoon and felt, quietly and without drama, that she had finally, at 73 years old, come all the way home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.